So currently in our series on ranking the various Roman emperors, we've left off at the Flavians. Now I'm going to talk about the next five emperors, what Edward Gibbon called the five good emperors and his decline and fall of the Roman Empire, which is probably the most famous book on the Roman Empire. You may have heard of it. If you haven't heard of it, it's one of the original studies done by Gibbon. Its arguments are not as persuasive in modern historiography, but they play a big role, and it's a good reference point for maybe not starting to read about the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic, but at least it's a good starting point in terms of getting your feet wet and understanding the historiography itself. Now, hopefully, by the end of this series and by this point with our 11th Princeps Domitian, who I left off at, you can see that there's been more than just five good emperors. There's actually been a handful, really outside of Caligula and Nero. Pretty much most of the Princeps have been good so far, but you can also see where Nero is in power, that if someone is not a good princeps, how quickly the system erodes. And this is the important part, that when Caesar Augustus set up the Principe, the princeps, the first citizen, father of his country, all these various titles and these gestures to a republic that no longer really exists, it's essentially a modern military dictatorship. Not in the way the Romans would think of dictatorship, especially not in its office, but in our modern conception of a military dictatorship. Think of a Napoleon Bonaparte in France, for example. Really much that idea, though a little bit more nuance within the Roman Empire, because there is a lot of power in the provincial governors. There's a lot of people that have power within the individual legatos. The Praetorian Guard has its own power. There's a lot of different power centers, but it's really much, essentially, for all intents and purposes, a military dictatorship. And so when Domitian gets assassinated by essentially a court coup, it doesn't descend into civil war, which is mostly because after Domitian gets assassinated, they get into the princeps very quickly, and no one really gets a chance to notice that Domitian has been killed and been replaced because it's done so quickly and quietly. But again, the Flavian dynasty in general has been very successful at fixing all the problems that Nero created, putting the empire back together, prevent it from falling apart, and stabilize the economy, stabilize the political situation. And they're much better overall than the Julian Claudians, because while the Julio Claudians very much oscillated between good and practical to a bit too indulgent, and Caligula and Nero, Titus, Domitian, and Vespasian are very much focused on ruling as well as they possibly can. And the Flavians are very important because they give us people like Tacitus and Suetonius who write about this period of Roman history. They're equites who get their start under the Flavian dynasty, though they'll later try to distance themselves from the Flavians because politically expedient. The Flavian dynasty overall, A tier, because inflation.